Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This time we're going really deep into a case that's both tragic and incredibly complex, the death of Amanda Peralt.
Oh, yeah, this one's a tough one.
We've got a ton of information for this one. Court transcripts, interviews, even a video doorbell recording.
Wow, that's a lot.
All of it centers around the question, was it suicide as the medical examiner ruled, or was it something more sinister?
It really is amazing.
Yeah.
You see these cases, and on the surface, they seem so simple.
Right.
But when you really start to peel back the layers,
Yeah.
they unravel into these intricate mysteries, and you find yourself asking, was it really suicide?
Right. Was it really open and shut?
Yeah, so the official ruling of suicide is just the beginning for us.
Mm.
We'll be examining all the evidence, all the different stories, and trying to understand, the questions that are still unanswered even after the trial.
Exactly. And we want you, the listener, to be right there with us.
Yeah.
Weighing the facts and coming to your own conclusions.
Yep.
So let's start with the foundation of this story, the relationship between Amanda and her husband, Seth.
Okay.
They met online back in 2011, and things moved pretty quickly between them.
Yeah, it was a whirlwind romance, to say the least.
Mhm.
Within 6 months, Amanda had moved in with Seth. Now, at the time, Seth was battling cancer, and he was unemployed, so he was relying heavily on his family for financial support.
So that kind of sets the stage for Amanda to step in as a caretaker almost.
It does. She becomes increasingly devoted to Seth.
Which, on the surface, sounds admirable, but
But there were some red flags even in those early days.
like what?
Well, Seth, he exerted a lot of control over who Amanda was communicating with. She wasn't working. They were pretty isolated from her family.
So almost like a classic recipe for a relationship heading for disaster.
Yeah, a lot of those classic signs.
And then there's the unusual courthouse wedding in 2017, which seems kind of impulsive.
Yeah.
And it happened right around the time that Seth was in a custody battle for his daughter from a previous relationship. So do you think those two events could be connected?
It's a great question, and it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me how quickly the dynamics of power and control were established in this relationship.
Yeah, for sure. So we're seeing this dependence, we're seeing isolation. And then in 2019, things seem to escalate when Seth gets injured.
Right.
Amanda's sisters started reporting more frequent fights fueled by alcohol and pain medication.
Oh, so they could hear this happening over the phone.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awful.
And they offered to call 911, but Amanda begged them not to.
Which is so common in abusive relationships.
Right.
Victims, they feel trapped, they think they can handle it themselves, or they're afraid of what will happen if they call for help.
Right. So what was going through Amanda's mind? Was she scared? Was she hopeful things would get better? Or was she just trying to protect Seth?
Well, we can't know for sure, but it's important to understand just how much pressure victims are under. Would you feel safe calling for help? Would you be worried about the consequences?
I mean, it's tough to say what you would do in that situation.
Exactly.
And then on January 28th, 2020, the tension boils over, and we have that really chilling 911 call where Amanda reports Seth's physical abuse. She's so terrified, she runs to a neighbor's house to get away.
This wasn't even an isolated incident. The 911 dispatcher actually recognized Seth's name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they noted that he had a history of violence.
That's scary.
It's terrifying. It suggests a pattern of aggression that maybe went unreported for who knows how long.
It's heartbreaking to think that she might have been putting up with this for years before finally reaching her breaking point.
It is.
So Seth is arrested, and here's where things get really interesting. At his bond hearing, Amanda refuses to sign a stay-away order. So can you help us understand this? Why would she allow him to come home after what just happened?
This is where the psychology of domestic abuse gets really complex.
Okay.
So a bond hearing is basically where a judge decides if someone can be released from jail while they wait for their trial. A stay-away order would legally prevent Seth from contacting Amanda. So her refusal to sign that order is confusing at first, but it actually shows how much control he had over her.
So she's terrified of him, but she's defending him in court. It's like she's more afraid of defying Seth than of what might happen if he came home.
Exactly. Victims often make choices that don't make sense to people looking in from the outside.
Yeah.
But they're making those choices from a place of fear and manipulation and all these complicated emotions. Their choices are often about survival.
So just 5 days later, on February 3rd, 2020, Amanda is found dead. Seth's story is that she shot herself after they had an argument. It seems open and shut, right?
Well, on the surface, yeah. But when Sheriff Sills arrived, he noticed some things that didn't quite add up to a simple suicide.
Okay, what kind of things?
Just little things at first. The position of Amanda's body, the way the gun and the ejected magazine were laying there was no blood on her hands. things that an experienced investigator would notice.
Oh, okay. So it's not adding up.
Not quite. And there are a couple more things that really make you wonder what happened that day.
Okay, I'm listening.
He found a damp towel hidden in the closet, and the deputy who got there first said that Seth smelled strongly of shampoo, like he just showered.
So, like, he was trying to wash something away.
It's a strange detail, right? Why would he need to shower right after finding his wife dead?
Yeah, like, what's he trying to hide?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then during the interview with Sheriff Sills, Seth's story started changing. Details, different timelines were messed up, and his whole attitude just screamed guilty conscience.
Inconsistent stories are never a good sign.
You're right. And then there's this handwritten recantation letter that they found in Amanda's nightstand. In the letter, she admits to lying about the abuse.
Wait a minute, a recantation letter? That sounds pretty convenient for Seth. Was it real?
That's just it. The words in the letter and even the handwriting raised questions about whether Amanda really wrote it on her own. It's possible, even likely, that Seth forced her to write it, to silence her and protect himself.
So he was trying to control the story even after she was gone.
Yeah, it's chilling. So we've got these inconsistencies, a changing story, and a possibly fake letter, all pointing to something much darker than a simple suicide.
This is getting really complicated.
We're just getting started. There's more evidence to look at and more twists and turns to uncover.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's keep digging into this and see what other secrets we can uncover. Listeners, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll go even deeper into the investigation and explore the evidence that led to Seth's arrest and trial.
When we left off, we had some pretty big doubts about Seth's side of the story. But as investigators dug deeper, they found a piece of evidence that totally blew his alibi out of the water.
Okay, I bet Sheriff Sills was pretty happy about that. What was it?
Surveillance footage?
Ah.
Remember, Seth said that he and Amanda stayed home all day on February 3rd after he dropped his daughter off at school?
Right.
Well, turns out that was a total lie.
Oh, no.
Security cameras from a nearby liquor store and a convenience store caught them both out and about hours before Amanda died.
So he wasn't just telling an inconsistent story, he was straight up lying.
Yep. So let's break down what the footage showed.
Okay.
The liquor store footage shows Amanda driving Seth's truck up to the drive-thru.
Okay.
You can clearly see her in the driver's seat buying those little bottles of Fireball whiskey that were later found empty at the crime scene.
Oh, wow.
So that puts her right there at the store buying the alcohol,
Yeah.
which completely contradicts what Seth told the police.
It's crazy how those little details can be so important.
Absolutely. Now, the convenience store footage is interesting, too.
Okay, what'd they see there?
That footage only shows Seth inside the store. He's looking around buying a drink. But here's the thing. He was wearing a very specific outfit, a Pink Floyd t-shirt and black athletic pants.
I remember those, because those were the clothes that were found dry in the washing machine at their house, even though he was wearing something completely different when the cops got there.
Exactly, which is a huge red flag.
Yeah.
It makes it seem like he changed his clothes after the shooting, maybe to get rid of evidence.
And remember, the deputy who tried to serve Seth those legal papers just 20 minutes before he called 911 said Seth smelled like he had just showered.
It all seems pretty suspicious, right? Changing clothes, showering, waiting to call 911 doesn't look good.
Definitely not the actions of an innocent man. It seems more like he was trying to cover his tracks.
Exactly. And the inconsistencies don't stop there. Remember how the gun and the ejected magazine were found at the scene?
Yeah.
Well, the way those things were positioned made it seem like it would have been almost impossible for Amanda to have shot herself that way.
Oh, so it wasn't just about fingerprints or gunshot residue. The crime scene itself was telling a different story.
Exactly. The prosecution brought in experts who said that for the magazine to be ejected, that the gun would have had to be held in a very specific way, a way that Amanda couldn't have done it if she was shooting herself.
Okay, so that really complicates things. And what about the medical examiner's ruling of suicide? I mean, based on everything we've talked about, it doesn't seem to fit at all.
Yeah, it was a controversial ruling, for sure. The medical examiner focused mainly on the lack of gunpowder stippling around the wound, which usually means the gun was pressed right against the skin, like in a suicide.
But it seems like she didn't really consider all the other evidence, the things Seth was saying that didn't make sense, the signs that maybe there was a struggle, and just all the weird stuff surrounding the whole situation.
You're right. It really makes you question if you can rely only on physical evidence, especially when there's so much other evidence that points in a different direction.
You have to look at the whole picture, right? Not just one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that's why even though the medical examiner said it was suicide, Sheriff Sills and the district attorney, they decided to keep going with the case. They thought they had enough to prove that Amanda's death wasn't a suicide, but a murder.
Wow, it sounds like they were up against a lot. How did they even build a strong enough case to take Seth to trial?
They focused on showing who Seth really was. Not just a grieving husband, but a controlling and abusive partner capable of violence and lies. They presented the inconsistencies in his story, the physical evidence that didn't match up, and most importantly, they brought in witnesses who could talk about the abuse Amanda had suffered.
That must have been so hard for Amanda's family and friends having to relive all that pain in court.
Absolutely.
Oh.
But their testimony was really important to show that there was a pattern of abuse and to fight back against the defense trying to say that Amanda was unstable or suicidal.
So they weren't just giving facts, they were telling a deeper story.
Right, and one of the most powerful moments was when they played a video that Amanda had recorded on her phone just 7 months before she died.
Oh, wow. What was on the video?
It showed Seth in a rage, yelling at Amanda, threatening her. It was chilling to see how angry he was and how scared she was.
I can't imagine how difficult that was for her family to watch.
It was. But it also gave the jury clear proof that Amanda had been abused. And it shows how important it is for victims to document their experiences, even though it's hard to do. Those recordings can be powerful evidence.
Yeah, it's scary to think how technology can be used for bad things, but it can also be used to get justice and give a voice to people who have been silenced.
You're right. And in this case, those text messages, photos, and that video were really important to show when the abuse happened and to prove that the defense's arguments were wrong.
But it wasn't just technology, right? You mentioned witnesses. Who else spoke up about the abuse?
Amanda's sisters testified. They shared some really heartbreaking stories about the fights they overheard, the fear that Amanda had told them about, and how they begged her to leave Seth. Their testimony painted a picture of a woman stuck in a cycle of violence and control.
So they were able to back up what Amanda had said and show the bigger picture of the abuse.
Exactly. And then there was Seth's own daughter from his previous relationship.
Oh, right.
She was a key witness because she was there when Amanda called 911 on January 28th.
I bet it was really hard to get her to testify, considering she was right in the middle of all this.
It was a tough situation. At first, she talked about seeing Seth being physically abusive towards Amanda, but during the trial, she changed her story.
Oh, so her testimony ended up helping the defense.
It did. It caused some confusion and made people wonder if she was telling the truth. The defense said that she had been coached or influenced by others to change her story.
That's so sad to think about. It's a good example of how hard it is to get reliable testimony from children, especially in these really intense situations.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to be careful and sensitive when working with child witnesses to make sure they're safe and not being pressured.
So we've got Seth's daughter changing her story, the scary video evidence, and what Amanda's sister said. It's a lot for the jury to think about. Was there anything else the prosecution used to prove their case?
They brought in a guy who had been in jail with Seth. This guy claimed that Seth confessed to him while they were locked up together.
Wow, a jailhouse confession. That sounds like a big win for the prosecution. Did the jury believe him?
It's not always that simple jailhouse informants aren't always trustworthy. They often have their own reasons for working with the authorities. And this particular guy had a long criminal history, which the defense used to make him seem less believable.
So it wasn't a sure thing for the prosecution?
No. The defense said that the informant was making up the confession so he could get a shorter sentence or something like that. It definitely made people question if he was telling the truth.
So with all this back and forth and conflicting information, how did the jury even figure out what to believe?
It was a tough job. They had to decide which witnesses were believable, look at the physical evidence, and ultimately decide if the prosecution had proved that Seth was guilty. Without a doubt, it was a complicated and emotional case, and the jury had a lot to consider.
I bet the courtroom was really tense. Did it take them a long time to decide?
It did. Almost 2.5 hours. Amanda's sisters were there the whole time, holding hands and hoping for justice.
Okay, tell me what happened. What was the verdict? Guilty.
Wow, justice for Amanda. What were the charges?
Seth Peralt was found guilty of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. The jury decided that the evidence showed Seth was the one who killed Amanda.
After all that back and forth and all those different stories, the truth came out.
It did. And for Amanda's family and friends, it was a moment of relief. It meant that their fight for justice had been worth it, but it also meant the start of a long and difficult journey of healing and trying to move on.
It's a bittersweet victory. Justice was served, but it doesn't bring Amanda back.
That's the hard part. The verdict ends the legal process, but the emotional pain is still there.
So Seth's behind bars justice has been served, but what does this case tell us about domestic violence in general?
That's an important question. Amanda's story shows us that domestic violence can happen anywhere to anyone. It's often hidden behind closed doors, kept secret, and full of shame.
And it shows how abusers use their power to control and manipulate their victims, making it even harder for them to escape. It's exactly. Seth being a police officer made things even more complicated. It probably made Amanda feel even more powerless. She might have been afraid that nobody would believe her if she spoke out against him.
That's a scary thought. It shows how important it is to believe victims support them and challenge the ideas in our society that allow abuse to continue.
We need to create a world where victims feel safe coming forward, knowing that they'll be heard, believed, and supported no matter what. Their abuser's job or their past choices shouldn't matter.
This case also shows how hard it can be to prosecute these kinds of crimes, especially when you have different stories, not much physical evidence, and a medical examiner's ruling that just doesn't seem to fit.
It was a challenge for the prosecution. They didn't have a clear piece of evidence or a confession. They had to build their case on circumstantial evidence, expert opinions, and a history of abuse that they showed through witness statements and Amanda's own records.
It shows how important it is to investigate these cases, thoroughly analyze evidence carefully, and be willing to question expert opinions when they don't make sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And think about it. If just one person on that jury had held on to that suicide ruling, justice might not have been served.
that's true. We also saw how important technology can be in these cases. Amanda's phone was like a silent witness. The video, the texts, the photos, they all helped prove what she had been through and showed that Seth was lying. It makes you think what other digital evidence is out there just waiting to be found and used to hold abusers accountable.
It's a little creepy, but also kind of amazing. Our digital lives can be used against us, but they can also be used to expose the truth.
We've talked a lot about the legal side of things, but I want to recognize the amazing work that Amanda's sisters have done to turn this tragedy into something positive.
They're incredibly strong. They've turned their grief into action, raising awareness about domestic violence and encouraging other victims to speak up.
I love that they do those balloon releases every year on Amanda's birthday, putting messages of hope and the hotline number on those purple balloons. It's such a beautiful tribute.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, there's still hope. And that even after a terrible loss, we can choose to do something good, something that helps others, and maybe even save lives. They've created a powerful legacy for Amanda.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the most important things we can learn from Amanda's story? What can we do to stop domestic violence?
It starts with knowing the signs. We need to learn about the signs of abuse, the cycle of violence, and the resources available to victims. The more we understand, the better we'll be at recognizing abuse and stepping in to help.
And don't wait for someone to ask for help. If you see something, say something. Offer support and let victims know they're not alone.
Exactly. And we need to challenge the things in our society that allow abuse to happen and keep victims quiet. Speak up against jokes or comments that make light of abuse, hold abusers responsible for their actions, and support policies that protect victims and give them the help they need.
We need to change how we think about this. Stop blaming the victim and create a world where everyone feels safe and strong enough to ask for help. We need to believe support and take action.
Amanda's case, while tragic, can be what makes things change. Her story is heartbreaking, but it can make us talk about domestic violence, raise awareness, and inspire action.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's still hope. And that by working together, we can create a world where domestic violence isn't something we ignore, but something we face head-on with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to justice.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here: the abuse, the evidence, the trial, the verdict, the advocacy, but there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't really talked about: the psychological factors involved. What can we learn from Amanda and Seth's relationship about how domestic abuse works?
Yeah, that's a really important part of this case. What are your thoughts on that?
Domestic violence is often about power control and manipulation. It's not just about physical violence.
So it's not just about the punches, but the emotional and mental scars that people don't see.
It's exactly. Abuse can be physical, emotional, verbal, financial, or sexual. It's all about one person controlling another person.
And how did that play out in Amanda and Seth's relationship?
One thing that's really clear is the cycle of abuse. First, you have the honeymoon phase, where the abuser is charming, attentive, and loving. Then comes the tension-building phase, where they get more controlling, critical, and verbally abusive.
And then it explodes into physical or severe emotional abuse.
Exactly. And after that, there's often remorse, apologies, promises to change, and a return to the honeymoon phase. And the cycle starts again, often getting worse each time.
It's a terrible pattern. And it can be really hard for victims to escape. They might feel trapped, isolated, or financially dependent on the abuser.
Amanda's case is a perfect example of this. She was isolated from her family, financially dependent on Seth, and probably believed his promises to change.
And Seth, being a police officer, made things even more complicated. It probably made her feel even more helpless, like nobody would believe her if she spoke out.
Absolutely. The power dynamic in their relationship was way off, and Seth probably used his position to scare and control her, making her think nobody would listen to her.
This case really shows how important it is to recognize the warning signs of domestic abuse. What are some red flags that people should look out for?
There are a lot, but some common ones are jealousy and possessiveness, where the abuser is always asking where their partner is trying to control who they see and checking their phone and social media.
So they're basically trying to cut them off from everyone else, making them totally dependent on the abuser.
Exactly. Another red flag is isolation, where the abuser tries to keep their partner away from friends and family, so they have to rely on the abuser for support and company.
And of course, there's verbal abuse, which can be just as damaging as physical violence. The abuser might constantly criticize, put down, or humiliate their partner, making them feel worthless.
Right. And we can't forget about financial control. The abuser might take control of the money, so their partner can't access it or has to depend on them financially.
It's all about power and control, taking away the victim's independence and making them feel trapped and powerless.
Exactly. It's a slow and sneaky process that's hard to see from the outside. But it's crucial that we learn about these patterns of abuse so we can spot them and do something before it's too late.
We need to remember that abuse can take many forms: physical, emotional, verbal, financial, and sexual. It's never the victim's fault, and there is help available.
That's so important to remember. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Abuse Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You're not alone, and there is support out there.
Let's talk about the forensic evidence again. It seems like some things were missed during the investigation that could have made the prosecution's case even stronger.
You're right. The fact that nobody checked the gun for fingerprints or tested Amanda's hands for gunshot residue was a big mistake. Those little details could have been really important evidence to prove or disprove what Seth was saying.
Yeah, if they had found Seth's fingerprints on the gun, or if Amanda's hands were covered in gunshot residue, it would have been much clearer what happened.
Absolutely. A thorough and careful forensic investigation is crucial in any criminal case, especially when it could be a murder. Every detail matters.
And in this case, those missing details could have meant the difference between a quick conviction and a long and difficult trial.
It shows how important it is to have high standards for our investigative agencies and make sure they have the resources and training to do thorough and fair investigations.
So we've talked about the abuse, the evidence, the trial, the verdict. But what happened to Seth after he was found guilty?
Seth Peralt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Sounds like he got what he deserved for taking someone's life.
The verdict and the sentence couldn't bring Amanda back, but it gave some closure to the people who loved her, in a sense that justice was done.
It's not much, but at least he's being held accountable for what he did.
Right. And the case also showed how serious domestic violence is and how terrible the consequences can be. It sent a message that abusers need to be held responsible for their actions.
It says that we won't tolerate abuse and that we will fight to protect those who are vulnerable.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is to keep advocating for and supporting victims of domestic violence. We need to create a world where everyone feels safe and empowered enough to ask for help, knowing they'll be believed and supported.
Let's go back to that recantation letter they found in Amanda's nightstand. It seemed pretty convenient for Seth, but it also raised some questions about how manipulative he was.
That letter was a classic example of how insidious emotional abuse can be. It's hard to imagine how much pressure Amanda must have felt to protect Seth, even if it meant hurting herself.
It's so sad. It's like he was still trying to control the story even after she was gone, making sure her voice was silenced and his lies continued.
That's why it's so important to understand the psychology behind domestic abuse.
Yeah.
It's not always about physical violence. It's about manipulation, coercion, and breaking down a person's self-worth.
It's about taking away their power, their voice, and their ability to fight back.
Exactly. And that's why we need to be aware. We need to recognize the signs, believe the victims, and create a culture where people feel supported and abusers are held accountable.
Well said. This case has been a roller coaster of emotions, anger, sadness, frustration, and finally some relief that justice was done.
It reminds us that even when things are really bad, there's still hope. and that by speaking out, supporting victims, and making sure abusers face consequences, we can work towards a future where tragedies like Amanda's don't happen anymore.
I couldn't agree more. Now, I think we've laid a good foundation for our last discussion. In the next part of this deep dive, we'll explore what this case means for the future, what we can learn from it, and what steps we can take to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
I'm ready to dive into that.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll finish up our exploration of this complex and heartbreaking case.
Okay, so we've spent the last 2 parts really digging into the Amanda Peralt case, the evidence, the trial, the psychology of abuse, but now I think it's time to take a step back and think about what this case teaches us. What's the bigger picture here?
You're right. It's not enough to just understand what happened in this one case. We need to learn from it. We need to figure out what we can do to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again. Amanda's story is sadly not an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem that we as a society need to address.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really struck me was how easy it is to dismiss victims. We
Oh,
see it all the time, and even in this case, there were signs that people didn't fully believe Amanda, maybe because her husband was a police officer or because she didn't leave the relationship sooner.
it's so easy to judge from the outside, isn't it? To say, well, why didn't she just leave without understanding what it's really like to be in an abusive relationship?
Domestic violence thrives on secrecy and control. Victims are often isolated from their support systems. They may be financially dependent on their abuser, and they're often terrified of what will happen if they speak out.
Amanda's sisters talked about how much pressure she was under to protect Seth's reputation to make it look like everything was fine. It's a reminder that we need to be more understanding and less judgmental when we approach these situations.
We need to create a culture where victims feel safe coming forward, knowing that they will be believed and supported no matter what.
This case also showed how hard it can be to prosecute these types of crimes, especially when you have conflicting stories, not a lot of physical evidence, and a medical examiner who ruled it a suicide.
It was a tough case for the prosecution. They didn't have a clear-cut piece of evidence like a murder weapon with fingerprints or a confession. They had to build their case piece by piece, using circumstantial evidence, expert opinions, and the pattern of abuse that emerged from witness statements and Amanda's own documentation.
It really highlights the importance of thorough investigation, careful forensic analysis, and being willing to challenge expert opinions when they don't fit with the rest of the evidence.
You're right. Even one juror holding on to that suicide ruling could have prevented justice from being served.
And we also saw how important technology can be in these cases. Amanda's cell phone was like a silent witness. The video she recorded, the text messages, the photos, they all helped to corroborate her story and contradict Seth's attempts to control the narrative.
It makes you wonder what other digital evidence is out there just waiting to be discovered and used to hold abusers accountable.
It's a double-edged sword technology, but it can be used for good.
We've talked a lot about the legal aspects of this case, but I want to take a moment to recognize the incredible work that Amanda's sisters have done to turn this tragedy into a force for positive change.
They've been through so much, and their strength and resilience are truly inspiring. They've channeled their grief into advocacy, raising awareness about domestic violence, and encouraging other victims to come forward and share their stories. I love that they do those balloon releases every year on Amanda's birthday, attaching messages of hope and the National Domestic Violence Hotline number to those purple balloons. It's such a beautiful and meaningful way to honor her memory.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still hope. And that even when faced with immense loss, we can choose to create something positive, something that helps others and might even save lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things we can all take away from Amanda's story? What can we do to make a difference in the fight against domestic violence?
It starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves about the warning signs, the cycle of violence, and the resources that are available to victims. The more we understand about this issue, the better equipped we'll be to recognize it and intervene.
And don't wait for someone to come to you for help. If you see something, say something, reach out, offer support, let victims know they're not alone.
We also need to be willing to challenge those societal norms that perpetuate violence and silence victims. We need to speak out against jokes or comments that minimize abuse, hold abusers accountable for their actions, and support policies that protect victims and provide resources.
It's about changing attitudes, shifting the blame away from the victim, and creating a culture where everyone feels safe and empowered to seek help. It's about believing, supporting, and taking action.
This case, as tragic as it was, can be a catalyst for change. Amanda's story, as heartbreaking as it is, has the power to ignite conversations, raise awareness, and inspire us all to do better.
It's a reminder that even in the face of such darkness, there is hope. And by working together, we can create a world where domestic violence is no longer a hidden epidemic, but a problem we confront head-on with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to justice.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something today and that you'll join us in the fight against domestic violence.
Remember, you're not alone. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Abuse Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. There are people who care and want to help.
And there are tons of resources available online and in your community if you're looking for more information or ways to get involved in this important cause.
Let's turn this tragedy into a turning point. Let's honor Amanda's memory by working together to create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered. Thanks for listening.